This is The Other Side with Damien Coury.
G'day and welcome to episode 10 of The Other Side Australia, a weekly shortcut to Australia's best commentary from a sensible centre-right perspective. Uploaded Friday, October the 30th, 2020. I'm Damien Coury and this is our bumper election edition, with both the Queensland and US elections to cover today. But in a moment, we will explore the big news of the week, the opening up of Melbourne. Alexandra Marshall will join me for a deep dive on the principles of liberty and the law, hearing from former Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett and the brilliant legal mind of former UK Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption. I'll be giving you a wrap of what to watch out for in Saturday's Queensland state election, the first big COVID election in the country. And Ray Radowski will be with us for the back half of the show as we explore the US election campaign's final days. We'll have an update on the Hunter Biden laptop story and Joe Biden's alleged troubling connections with China and Ukraine, and how most of the media continues to ignore the story pre-election. We'll discuss the bombshell TV interview this week with one of Hunter's former business associates that lends significant weight to the veracity of the laptop contents and email and phone messages. We'll look at the main points of the final debate between the president and his opponent, and Ray will give us his prediction for Tuesday. It's a big one, so let's get started. I'd like to just take an opportunity to thank everybody for supporting the podcast. Our growth in just 10 episodes has been quite remarkable. We could grow a lot more. We should grow a lot more. So please get out there and tell your friends about the podcast if you find it interesting and you're enjoying it. Also, please write to us. Let us know your feedback. Tell us what you think about the podcast. You can leave comments online, on YouTube, if you listen on YouTube, or you can email us at theothersideost, AUST, theothersideost at gmail.com. First up today, how could we possibly ignore the incredible, monumental level of freedom that has been bestowed upon the good burghers of Melbourne and Victoria by the divine King Daniel this week? What a joy. The beatings have stopped. Oh, praise the King. I feel so much better now. Joining me to talk about this today, Alexandra Marshall, the Queen of Australian Libertarian and Conservative Twitter. Alexandra, welcome once again to the show.
How are you doing?
I'm more disturbed than ever before by the I Stand With Dan ecstasy that was unleashed when the King decided to stop the beatings. The psychology of this is quite perverse, of course, because it mirrors abuse psychology. And I don't say that as a joke. I actually think that that is the psychology at play here, that people are worshipping him or feeling elated towards him simply because he was sharing the ecstasy of being able to be free with the people, and they felt that connection and that identification with him on that day when he announced it. But it's a weird, really, it takes Stockholm Syndrome to a whole new level, doesn't it?
Well, it's exactly what Mao did when he started his new glorious revolution. He convinced people who had a bad state in life to come to his cause, at which point he continued to abuse them and make their life even worse. And people held on to this vision that was never real. It was a lie from the beginning. And that is exactly what Daniel Andrews has done. He has convinced everyone to be terrified and that he will save them. And all he's done is destroy their lives. And he has given them this fraction of freedom. And they're like, yay. It's like, no. He's a serial killer who's kept you locked in a basement. There's no praise here. I don't know what's going on down there. It's like you've got all these people saying, oh, he's saved the state. Have you seen your retail strips lately? There is nothing left of your state. And when you finally open up and hit the streets, you will realize what level of destruction has actually happened while you weren't looking.
I saw a picture of Lygon Street the other day with the number of signs on shops that were just, literally boarded up saying that they're closing for good was disturbing to me. I used to love that city. I love Melbourne, lived there a couple of times, worked at 3AW in my youth. So it's a bit of a sad thing to see one of my favourite places in the world be affected like this, especially after just recently getting over one of my other favourite places in the world being destroyed by left-wing ideology. Of course, I'm speaking about Hong Kong and having to leave that great city. So
Well,
It is getting a bit
as far
worrying.
as far as Victoria goes, we know what they've done, but the question is, were they actually allowed to do it? And how did they gain the power to do what they have done? With Hong
Yes.
Kong, we know why, because China does what it likes. But we were under the impression that we lived in a Western democracy with a constitution and certain legal protections. So everyone's asking, how did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people of Hong Kong were sort of hoping that the basic law the mini constitution that they negotiated with Thatcher might hold out for the 50 years it was supposed to. But of course, after 20 years, as Beijing does, they do tend to do things in 20-year plans, very slowly, very gradually, and before you know it, whack. But what the difference that struck me, having gone through all of that in Hong Kong, was that when the Hong Kong government was forced by Beijing to introduce a law to change the education system and introduce a national curriculum, part of the China national curriculum into the local curriculum, 1 million people hit the streets. They understand and value liberty because they know it can be so easily taken away. And now, of course, sadly, it has been. It was inevitable, I guess. But the people of Melbourne, and I understand that there was the fear of all of the fines and the police force, the use of police force. But how could you just not even feel... I mean, I was just astounded at the number of people that were criticising those who were brave enough to go out and hit the streets.
Well, part of the problem is that it comes from our long history of English liberty, where we have a certain level of trust in our government because we have not had to fight for freedom from government tyranny in the same way that nations who have gone through full authoritarian regimes in the recent history, like the Russian state, like the French state, even the American state to an extent with its own civil war, countries like Australia and England in particular are reacting to COVID in a very similar fashion. We have assigned the role of our state as a kind of benevolent moral arbiter, because that is what it has been in the past. It has been there to settle conflict, but not to get involved in all of our lives. So we trusted when politicians started passing mandates that they were not going to be used against the liberty of the individual. If we were paying attention, and some people were, we would have seen straight away that the politicians of today are not the politicians of our history who wrote these original constitutions. Our politicians have started to erode the liberty of the state and are misusing power and convincing people to go along with it under the idea of fear, which is exactly what authoritarian regimes do, to rewrite laws without anybody protesting them. So that's why you don't have as many people on the streets. We've got a combination of trust, ignorance, and people who are afraid to challenge because they think they're going to die from COVID, not because they're afraid of their government.
Yeah. Now, somebody from the other side would say, look, you guys are crazy. You're talking about stuff that could never happen here. And I must say, before I lived overseas, I probably would have thought the same thing. But when you actually see how quickly that boiling frog effect can occur, and you turn around 1 minute and the liberty is gone, and that's with the resistance that the people of Hong Kong have put up. Have a look at the lack of resistance here. We are certainly aware of the threat that China brings. I think we're under alert to that. I don't think that they're ready to invade tomorrow, but there is an infiltration effect going on. It is a slow process, and they would be rubbing their hands with glee at what they've seen in terms of the subservience and the ease with which basic civil liberties have been overrun. Yeah?
Well, forget in general. We've just seen this week coming out information that some of our Australian politicians, as soon as they get to China, they're set up with young girls and then filmed and blackmailed by the Chinese CCP to infiltrate our political process from blackmail. That's a common practice.
Yeah, it is. And it's not a conspiracy theory. This is real, as we learned. If you listened to episode 9 of The Other Side Australia last week, you would have heard we reported on how the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, had addressed a Senate inquiry to say that he was going to be writing to all members of government in Australia, even down to council level, to warn them of the very real threat of this potential blackmail and what to be on the lookout for. Let's just go back to episode 9, have a quick listen to that, and then we'll come back with Alexandra. Overseas intelligence services have been trying to curry favour with Aussie politicians by taking advantage of their secret weaknesses, sexual preferences, infidelities, and greed.
We see evidence of intelligence services deceptively cultivating politicians at all levels of government who will advance the interests of the foreign countries. In the coming weeks, I will write to all Commonwealth parliamentarians to warn they are attractive targets for those trying to steal our secrets and manipulate our decision-making.
The advice to MPs would tell them what to look for and how they should handle it. The Director General of ASIO, just clearing up that we're not deluded into some sort of weird conspiracy theory here when we talk about Chinese infiltration of the political systems in the West and particularly here in resource-rich Australia. Alexandra, I want you to hang on for a bit. We're going to come back to you. And I want to just play now something I would normally never play, which is a clip from that idiotic Channel 10 panel program, The Project, where one of the people on the panel, who goes by the acronym PVO, I prefer to call him Pivo. He asks Jeff Kennett, the former Premier of Victoria, an interesting question. So this was on Monday night. So it was after Dan Andrews' press conference on Sunday where he announced that he wasn't going to be letting businesses restart as early as originally thought before he turned that over later in the week. So the question from Pivo was, Mr. Kennett, do you think 1 or 2 more days of this really matters after all these months? Not understanding, of course, that 1 or 2 more days really does matter when you're talking about government overreach and the deprivation of basic human freedom of movement and other liberties. So Mr. Kennett schooled him a little.
We've had 7 new cases today. 7. We have a population of 6.4 million people. And for 7 cases, 6.4 million people are continued to be held hostage by this Premier. New South Wales some days now have recorded more cases than us, and not only are they able to continue to trade, but they have no rings of steel. This is a communist state. People have died. People are losing their income and their businesses. And unfortunately, many in the community say, well, isn't this wonderful? Because what we're doing is avoiding what's happening in Europe and in the US. But we're not in Europe. We're not in the US. Victoria should be comparing itself with New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, Western Australia, etc. And by any similar test, this has been disastrously handled, and the corruption in the failure of the government and its ministers and public servants to be honest with the community they lead only compounds the problem.
Jeff, I don't make excuses for the Victorian Premier. I've slammed him over the contact tracing problems. I think I probably agree with a lot of your concerns, and I can understand the anger from a lot of Victorians. But I'm not sure that the inflated rhetoric about communism and all of these sort of things helps people who are on the fence just wondering what should happen.
Well, Peter, how would you describe it? We're locked down. We've had curfews. We can't travel around our state. Businesses can't open. And they're all decisions of one man. Now, all right, I accept communism, a bit over the top. But it's a dictatorship. He doesn't listen to people in his own party. He doesn't listen to business community and health officials. He is making these decisions on his own. And I guess, Peter, all I'm saying is this can't go on without there being years of damage, both to the mental welfare of a lot of our community, but also to our economy. Now, all right, maybe I went over the top with communism, but this is a dictatorship. I've never seen anything like it, and there's never been anything replicated in any other part of the world in dealing with this virus. So what would you call it?
Not communism or a dictatorship.
What would you call it?
Well, I would call it over the top.
Give me a name.
Well, I would call it over the top. I mean, he's elected by his own party. They can remove him. It's not a dictatorship.
800 people who have died. There are hundreds of people, families, small businessmen who have lost their income and their financial security. And what did you describe it as?
Over the top.
Over the top. Well, you're very lucky because you've still got a job. Over the top. Well, you keep drawing your salary, my friend. You're very, very fortunate. But I tell you what, there's a lot of people here in Victoria who will never, ever recover from the way in which we've handled this virus. It should never have been about elimination. It should have always been about managing it, like you've done in New South Wales.
Yep. That's Jeff Kennett, the former Victorian Premier, schooling young Pivo from Channel 10. Actually, he's not that young. I always used to watch his stories and think, oh, someone needs to guide that kid because he's going so far left wing and he's just, pushing out biased nonsense every night. And I've got no problem with doing biased stuff as long as you say it's commentary. Obviously, I do this show. It's got a very strong libertarian, classical liberal bias. But, this is supposed to be Channel 10's national network political news reporter. And I used to think, he just needs some guidance, this kid. He's only 9 years younger than me, and he's a professor of politics. So, I don't have quite so much sympathy for the guy anymore. So we're going to keep a close eye on Pivo on this show because Pivo does do propaganda, really. We're going to come back in a moment with Alexandra Marshall. Thanks for hanging on there, Ali. We're going to continue to talk about liberty deprivation. We're going to look at some of the legal stuff around liberty deprivation under British law. So that's coming up in a moment. Quite interesting stuff with Alexandra Marshall. So stay with us.
This is The Other Side with Damien Curry, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
And we are back on The Other Side with Alexandra Marshall, our Australian libertarian, classical, liberal, conservative commentator. Alexandra, we were talking about the Chinese infiltration, but that's only part of the story, right?
Let's look at not conspiracy, but what our politicians have actually done. That's just plain what they've actually got away with already. The power to take away rights from healthy people has never been done in Western civilization under a health act. We've only ever restricted the rights of people who are sick. Right. So not just us, but the UK and America, they've taken away rights of people who we have never done that before in our history. Jacinda Ardern has done the same thing as the Prime Minister of the UK, in which some of the actions they took were in front of the law that backed them up. So they had no respect for the sanctity of the laws that they were using and abusing at the time, and didn't even apologise for misusing their position of power after it was found out to be incorrect. So we've already got our politicians showing no respect for the law, using the law as almost a political tool. And what else have they done? They've destroyed millions of businesses and lives. That's never been done, not even in a time of war. So it's not really a conspiracy to say that the slippery slope to an authoritarian state has already happened, particularly in the UK, where police are exercising rights of arrest, which they are not even given under law, but they say that a crisis such as COVID should allow them to do whatever they like. Well, I'd say no, that should never be acceptable in a civilized state.
Now, the situation, the health threat in Europe and in the UK and America is much more severe than here as well, which amplifies the issue. But the measures that are being taken over there are not as draconian as the measures here, which makes it even worse what's happening here. But even with that sort of less draconian approach of the Johnson government, we've still got some very, very brilliant legal minds and senior legal minds in the UK. And remember, Australia basically has a British legal system. We are hearing some very prominent people talking about the potential illegality and the unprecedented nature of some of these laws.
Yes, there is a fabulous mind called Jonathan Sumption, and he is a former Supreme Court justice. Now, he gave a series of lectures a couple of years ago called the Reith Lectures, and there's a book from that called Trials of the State. Now, what he was interested in at the time was the overreach of the law into the Western world, particularly England. And that was due to the rise of the EU and the UN creating a huge portfolio of law that is not native to the English-speaking peoples. So our law was always designed to settle conflict between contracts and some basic civil liberties. What it does now is extend into the social and moral lives of individuals to the point where it has become a suffocating industry that is becoming a political beast.
Yes, let's have a listen to Lord Jonathan Sumption He is, as Alexandra just said, a former UK Supreme Court Justice. And this was what he said during his Wreath lecture in 2019, so pre-COVID. Let's have a listen.
The rule of law is one of the cliches of modern life, which tends to be invoked even by lawyers, without much reflection on what it actually means. The essence of it can be summed up in 3 points. First, public authorities have no power to coerce us except what the law gives them. Secondly, people must have a minimum of basic legal rights. One can argue about what those rights should be, but they must at least include the protection from physical violence and from arbitrary interference with life, liberty, and property. Without these, social existence is no more than a crude contest in the deployment of force. Thirdly, there must be access to independent judges to vindicate these rights, to administer the criminal law, and to enforce the limits of state power. At least as important as these, however, is a clear understanding of what the rule of law does not mean. It does not mean that every human problem and every moral dilemma calls for a legal solution. So, why has this vast expansion in the domain of law happened? The fundamental reason is the arrival of a broadly based democracy between the 1860s and the 1920s. Mass involvement in public affairs has inevitably led to rising demands of the state as a provider of amenities, as a guarantor of minimum standards of security, and as a regulator of economic activity. Optimism about what collective action can achieve is natural to social animals. Law is the prime instrument of collective action, and rising expectations of the state naturally lead to calls for legal solutions. In some areas, a legal solution is dictated by the nature of the problem. Take, for example, the unwelcome side effects of technological and economic change, what economists call externalities. Industrial sickness and injury, pollution, monopoly, climate change, to name only some of the more obvious ones. Economic growth is the spontaneous creation of numberless individuals, but spontaneous action cannot address the unwanted collective costs that go with it. Only the state can do that. So we have laws against cartels, against pollution, and so on. But there are other areas where the intervention of law is not forced on us. It's a collective choice. It reflects pervasive changes in our outlook. Until the 19th century, most human interactions were governed by custom and convention. The law dealt with a narrow range of human problems. Today, law penetrates every corner of human life. The standard modern edition of the English statutes fills about 50 stout volumes with more than 30 volumes of supplements. In addition, there are currently about 21,000 regulations made by ministers under statutory powers, and nearly 12,000 regulations made by the European Union, which will continue to apply unless and until they are repealed or replaced by domestic legislation. In a single year, ending in May 2010, more than 700 new criminal offences were created, 3/4 of them by government regulation.
Now, of course, the problem with an expanding law system, in order for the law to expand, the citizens of the nation have to invite it. So when you tell the government, I'm frightened of COVID, you are inviting them to create laws to govern your life and take away your liberties. And so the more people criticize Daniel Andrews for every death here and how do they get out of this hotel quarantine and how can they get over here, you are, in effect, giving him an open invitation and a blank check to continue his reign of terror and to make even more mistakes, because as we have learned, the government cannot keep you safe from a natural viral plague like COVID-19. Not that COVID wasn't invented in the lab, but viruses are a part of the human condition. We will always have to deal with them. You don't deal with them by shutting down the entire civilization, which if you read Jonathan Sumption's other wonderful book on the early France and English civilization, they wouldn't have gotten anywhere if they stopped every time a virus came through, because they had it every other week. So we can't treat human civilization this way.
So, Alexandra, I keep saying this, but I've just come back to Australia after living abroad for 2 decades. I wasn't part of the boiling frog effect. So I've, like a lot of expats, come in and out, and we all sit around bars in Hong Kong scratching our heads saying, what's happening down there? Things seem to be changing. It's turning into a nanny state. There's so many rules and regulations now.
Well, that's exactly right. Law is about reducing risk, and we have become a very risk-averse society.
But
so
culturally, how do we shift to being a people who want this protection? We would joke about, there'd be a shark attack and people would be saying the government ought to do something about shark attacks. It's like, next thing you'll stub your toe and you want the government to do something about it. I mean, it's just the mentality invites, as you say, it invites over-regulation.
It's this perfect storm of two different ideas. The first is our wonderful cotton wool generation, who are adverse to any kind of danger or harm to themselves, be it emotional or physical.
Right.
The second, which started before Generation Snowflake. Snowflake. Oh, I know, that's what they really are, is the idea of litigation, a heavily litigant society in which you can sue anybody for anything. So It's one thing to sue someone for building a balcony that collapses through its own faults. It's another to trip over walking down the road and decide that you're going to sue the council because you can't look at the ground properly. We are heavily into that latter category, and we brought it in to the workplace where we started to try and blame the employer for every stupid thing that you did in an office. And that led to an arms race of litigation, which has left at the end of it the government creating all these laws to cover all these cases. And that's the bulk of law's expanding empire.
With very little regard for unintended consequences.
Yes, so we invited the courts to solve problems which would never have normally been solved by the courts. You would have been told, look where you're going, don't come into this courtroom. That would have been your answer 100 years ago. Instead, we change every footpath in the state to a new building code because one person is an idiot. That's how this stuff starts. So that's what you missed when you were in Hong Kong. And we got that from America, which is even worse than over here as far as suing everyone you see.
Yes, well, they've always had that reputation, but I remember seeing even some data like decades ago that New South Wales exceeded the number of litigation cases brought, exceeded the level of California one year, back in the 90s, I think it was. So, we were never far behind, I don't think. But anyway, look, I mean, this idea that the government, that there should be laws in place to protect us, that there should be regulations for safety at the workplace, these are all very reasonable things, are they not?
It's the extent at which you need to be protected. So a good thing is, like, I'm a woman, let's talk about the Me Too phenomena. The idea that I should be protected from sexual assault in the office is, of course, true. But let's not forget that law already existed before because it's a civil case. The idea that I should be protected from someone asking me out on a date and that it becomes an office policy and a legally enforceable rule is an overreach of our idea of safety. So this is how we ended up with this idea of Daddy Dan down in Victoria, protecting you from every single thing, including a virus. It's not actually his responsibility. He doesn't care if you get cancelled. He doesn't care if you get the normal flu. He doesn't care if you drink yourself into a stupor or if you go down to their legally government-sanctioned injecting rooms and kill yourself that way. He only cares about things that will expand his power in government, which is why they latched on to not only COVID, but Extinction Rebellion. And before that, what were the other, and Antifa protests and Black Lives Matter. Those are all ideas that seem like they're for public health in one way or form, but are actually a method of expanding the power of government.
And
that's the difference.
Yeah. And we're seeing this happening internationally in supranational laws and institutions like the United Nations, the European Union, etc.
Why have we invited the United Nations to infringe upon our laws and add additional laws that supersede our existing law. In some cases, they supersede the rights and the wishes of the public. And even some of the EU laws are starting to infiltrate our system via our free trade arrangements that we're trying to sign up. So I don't know if you saw it.
It was one of the reasons why the UK wanted to pull out of Brexit, obviously, was to avoid the excess regulations and the stifling regulations of the EU, or at least avoid the transfer of power away from London to Brussels. But it's just in doing trade. I mean, if you want to trade with the United States, if you want to trade with the EU, you've got to do it under their regulations.
Well, let me give you a prime example. When Julie Bishop was in charge, the EU wanted us to sign a UN doctrine in order to attain a free trade with the EU. Now, what business is it of theirs what we do with the UN? This is the sort of overreach we're talking about by treaty. And treaty is an insidious way of writing laws because it does not go through our parliament. But that's an additional point. What I find interesting is the idea of sovereign liberty of nations and how we seem to have lost that on a global scale. Not just liberty inside our state and inside, as individuals inside our own country. We can't even travel from border to border. I wasn't born as a New South Wales person. I was born as Australian, and I can't come and visit you in Queensland. That's, we are now trapped inside our states, which I find just amazing.
Now, Alexandra, do you self-describe as a libertarian or a classical liberal like me?
Oh my God. Okay, so I am a centrist libertarian. So I am a blue ribbon conservative with some libertarian leanings. So I definitely am not a full-blown libertarian. I don't think anybody today in politics is seriously a pure libertarian, because you wouldn't be advocating for a political system.
No, it's anarchy. But it's anarchy at the extreme. But yes,
exactly.
None of us are pure libertarians.
You'd be living in the bush. Now, I do know a couple of libertarians who have gone bush. So that's sort of the extent of libertarianism. No one really is that far. But
I could be tempted lately, I got to tell you.
Well, I do have a farm, so I could go for libertarian, but I'm not there yet. But as far as social ideas go, I do sit slightly to the left. But in today's 2020 politics, I think I'm basically, far alt-right something, according to the left. That's, centre line is now off the cliff somewhere. Yeah.
Okay. If you understand why I've been following you on Twitter for 2 years, because
correct.
I think we're fairly aligned.
If you're Stalin, you're no longer considered to be centrist, apparently. So,
yes.
Whatever.
Given that we're no longer lefties, let's talk about libertarianism or you may never have been, but let's talk about libertarianism and what this means for libertarianism and the principles of liberty, full stop.
Yes, I think we're talking about old English liberty in that sort of sense of what people fought for hundreds of years, to be represented by their parliament, universal suffrage. I think this is what people mean when they say that they are a libertarian in today's Western society. Yeah. They don't want to be a tool of the state. And now what we have seen is a new culture of spying on each other for the state, reporting on each other for Daniel Andrews down in Victoria, jobbing people in for not doing what the state has told us they should do. This is not the tradition of English liberty. That is something that you would almost be thrown out of the country for being a traitor if you acted that way toward your fellow members in society. This new status quo, which is an anti-liberty stance, is driven purely by fear amongst the people, and it is encouraged by the unions like the CFMMEU and the Labor Party, who want to, or have seen an opportunity to transform a small business-led individual society into a heavily unionised and dependent workforce on the state. It's the thing that they have never been able to do in Australia's history because we've been so successful, and now they've got everyone locked up. They have seized on this change, hoping they can have a different sort of revolution in Australia, and that would be an economic revolution. And to some extent they are succeeding with JobKeeper and JobSeeker. People are being tied to the state while their businesses are being destroyed and industries are collapsing all around them. Entire supply lines have collapsed. And we have to wonder what's going to be put back in their place once the general working class are impoverished and stripped of their assets. Exactly. That's a very serious question. I've not heard any of our politicians talk about it seriously, about how they are going to recover the state.
Alexandra, it's been fascinating talking to you today. Thank you very much for joining me to sort of co-host the first half of the show. We are out of time. Next week, we're going to do, I'm going to play some more of Lord Sumption, because he's just done a an interview specifically related to COVID. Let's just have a quick listen to a clip of that now. Next week we'll have a longer segment with Lord Sumption's thinking on how COVID has impacted on our fundamental core libertarian values in the West.
The Coronavirus Act was primarily concerned to enlarge the government's powers to marshal the medical resources of the country and to authorise additional public expenditure. But tucked away in Schedules 21 and 22, there were additional powers to control the movements of people. The important point to note is that apart from the power to prevent events or gatherings, the Act conferred no power to control the lives of healthy people. The measure stood in a long tradition dating back many centuries by which infectious diseases are controlled by the confinement of infectious people and not by the confinement of healthy ones.
And that's former UK Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption speaking at Cambridge on a Zoom presentation this week, actually. Alexandra Marshall, once again, thank you very, very much for joining us. We're going to turn to the Queensland and US elections next. Ray Radowski is going to join me for the US stuff right after we have a little look at Annastasia's track record in Queensland. And it's astounding to me that she is favourite to win. It really is astounding when you think about all that went on before COVID. But anyway, that's how politics rolls. Thanks very much for your time once again, Ellie Melly, at Ellie Melly on Twitter, ELLYMELLY.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damien Curry. Not the sort of show you'd hear on the ABC. And we're not forcing you to pay for it either.
Tomorrow's Queensland state election is going to be tight, with polls showing that the state is likely to be headed for a hung parliament and a minority government. If Labor wins, they'll hold power with the Greens, who've increasingly been proving themselves to be a radical far-left mob, more Extinction Rebellion than Greenpeace, a view that was made clear by a stunt in which they dumped a truckload of manure in front of the state's parliament this week, again disrupting inner Brisbane traffic and hurling offensive slurs at Labor's controversial former deputy, Jackie Trad. If the polls have the same kind of bias against the so-called shy Conservatives as the federal, New South Wales and US polling, LNP leader Deb Frecklington might win easily. The deciding seats will be in the North Queensland city of Townsville. Labor Premier Palaszczuk, having gone into the COVID crisis with a bad track record on the economy, jobs, debt and corruption investigations of Trad, will be pinning all of her hopes on her COVID-19 management, or at least the perception of her COVID-19 management. She's hoping that the, shall we say, less aware Queenslanders who believe she and her religious obedience and abdication of responsibility to her unelected chief medical officer was a good way to manage things will get her over the line. But in recent weeks, more and more people in Queensland have been waking up to the political game she was actually playing with the state's economy and the people's liberty and livelihoods. Some believe that if the LNP had a leader more experienced and stronger than Deb Frecklington, one who differentiated the party more clearly, it'd be in a much stronger position heading into this election. But Frecklington, to be fair, had the challenging task of differentiating her approach to COVID without seeming to be putting the state's citizens at risk. The main word in that sentence being seeming. Frecklington chose not to differentiate on COVID strategy and stuck to the safe, I'll listen to the chief health officer and probably keep the borders closed too message. Frecklington was former LNP leader Tim Nicholls' deputy in 2017 when they were beaten for a second time by Labor. It looks like the minor parties will play a big role. Federal political legend Bob Katter's son Robbie's party, the Katter Australia Party, is strong in the 3 country seats that it currently holds. Support for the Greens is rising because of climate alarmism, the stupidity of its child leadership notwithstanding. They won a posh inner city Brisbane seat from the LNP by scooping up Labor preferences back in 2017. It was their first seat ever. And although they look set to lose it back to a vibrant new young LNP candidate, Lauren Day, Jackie Trad's problems mean her Bohemian Lace seat of South Brisbane is at risk, with the Greens very likely to pick that one up instead. On the Conservative side, apart from Katter's party, One Nation has been a bit quiet this time round, but Clive Palmer's been spending like crazy on election ads that will have an impact in delivering preferences to the LNP, no doubt. I'd hope that the people of Queensland remember the reality that they have the country's worst unemployment rate in a state that should have the best, given its blessings, that we're sitting on a $100 billion state debt due to a lack of disciplined, careful management of the people's money by the bloated bureaucracy. Queensland has the highest number of public servants per capita of any state in Australia too. And while the frontline staff are needed, the backroom pen pushers are wasting a lot of resources. Something you'll never hear the LNP say out loud. They lost the biggest majority in the state's history to Labor because of former Premier Campbell Newman's attempt to do the right and moral thing and trim back the state's spending and waste on jobs funded by taxpayers. This election really comes down to the intelligence and memory of Queenslanders. Will they vote rationally on the things that truly matter, remembering the poor economic management and corruption of Labor? Will they ask themselves whether they want Dan or Gladys's style of management of a future COVID outbreak? Will they consider the unnecessary economic and human suffering caused by a state border closure that ran way beyond its necessary time frame to keep the people safe? Or will they buy the simplistic narrative that the Premier was doing it all just to keep Queenslanders safe and not because there was an election around the corner? Not even the high-profile former Labor Premier Peter Beattie is necessarily buying that one.
Look, I understand what the Queensland government did, and if I was there, I probably would have done the same thing. So I'm not being critical of the past. I'm actually saying now is the time to move forward. Now is the time, whoever wins the Queensland election, whether it's Annastasia or Deb Freckington, whoever wins, they're going to be faced with an economic tsunami. Not a good one. So they've got to work out how to go from here. What I'm saying is, okay, what was done in the past, let's give everyone a big tick for that. Let's move forward. And the way to move forward is to open up the borders.
Premier Palaszczuk was not impressed with Mr Beattie's comments this week.
Well, I will listen to the health advice. That is what I've always maintained, and that is what has made Queensland stand strong during these times. We have a strong health response, which means our economy is opening up.
The problem with that I will do whatever the Chief Health Officer recommends position is that it's an abdication of responsibility as a leader. It's the job of a leader to take advice from numerous senior specialists and consider all aspects of a situation from the big picture perspective and make a balanced, sensible decision. And most importantly, have the guts to own that decision. On that front, Anastasia's management of COVID has been cowardly, too safe, and detrimental to everything and everyone else much more than it needed to be. And that is the hallmark of a very poor leader, not a good one. Fingers crossed, Queensland. You deserve much, much better than you've got. And this is the week, folks. This is election week, not just for sunny Queensland, but also for that big country over the ocean, the United States of America. And joining us is our North America expert, the cool Canadian, Ray Radowski. How are you, Raymond?
I'm great. And the clock is ticking. It's like, just a few days before the actual vote.
Now, last week we did a 20-minute special on the Hunter Biden laptop story. What did it mean? Where did it come from? Why isn't the media covering it? That they should be covering it. So I'm going to just let people go back and have a listen to that. If you haven't heard it yet, just click on episode 9. I think it starts about 20 minutes in, and it's a 20-minute special on that topic and that story where we go through it step by step right from the beginning and explain it in really simple terms. But where are we now, Ray? It's a week on now. Do we have any more evidence that this laptop is real, or that the allegations that this laptop raises might be real?
Absolutely. First of all, you've got a few different sort of actors in this, or people who were either on the emails or received the emails coming forward and verifying that, yeah, in fact, this was part of a conversation that we had. The actual laptop is now in the hands of law enforcement, and there's been absolutely no denial by the Biden campaign saying this is not the real laptop. What they have done instead is suggested that there's been some sort of Russian interference. And that somehow,
Okay.
but how they don't really link it to the laptop. It's not like the Russians planted this laptop at the repair shop and had all these emails that people who were on attest to being real.
As
But
far as you know, is anybody else now picking up the story, or is it still just the Murdoch media, so the New York Post, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, I know has touched it, but I mean, has the mainstream media decided, oh dear, we can't ignore this anymore, we can't cover up for Joe on this one?
Not only have they gone in that direction, National Public Radio, which I think is like national radio in very many other countries, including Australia,
our ABC,
has come
yes.
out, right, has come out and said, we're not going to cover it because it's, quote, irrelevant. They said that.
Right.
How a respectable media outlet can ignore a story that has a variety of different elements and has not been refuted by the campaign is beyond me.
I'm just going to say this right up front. Whether the allegations against Biden are true or not, and they probably are true, which we're going to talk about in a moment because of what's come out just in the last few hours before we're recording this. But let's say they're not even true. There is still enough evidence, enough information here to warrant a journalist worth half their salt exploring the story and looking further into it, and writing perhaps a cautiously worded story about it and framing it that way. But to not cover the thing at all, that is to me the most disturbing part of this whole affair, that we can no longer really trust, as a centrist, I'm a center-right sort of leaning person. I don't believe everything I hear on Fox News. And I try to listen to all news to get a balanced perspective, even though I'm a liberal-minded person. But I don't think I can ever trust the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, PBS, CNN. I mean, that's depressing to me. I mean, these were, in my childhood, quite respectable, balanced news outlets.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the whole story is being covered directly around party and ideological lines. So you've got the pro-Trump or the conservative blogs and media digging through the emails. You've got the Steve Bannon podcast, which is on every night, going through and making revelations. The One America Network making revelations about what's in it. And on the other side, they're covering things like a surge in COVID cases, which they're trying to pin on the Trump administration not being on the ball on this. So again, it looks like
they're staying on script,
pretending it doesn't exist.
I can't rationalize as a perhaps former journalist. I don't know if you can, as a former journalist, rationalize how you could be presented with this much information of this nature, of this importance, at this level, at this time, and not at least mention it in context, even if you don't believe it necessarily to be true. But to actually say we're not going to cover it at all because we don't want people to be informed about it is basically saying we're going to act as the public relations arm of the Democratic Party, as the mainstream media here, and ignore the thing. Now let's just move on, because this thing to me is looking very real in terms of at least a significantly concerning degree of potential compromise. We didn't touch on the China deals last week when we spoke. We only spoke about Ukraine. But the focus this week has been on this deal with the China Financial Corporation, the CFC, I think it's called, which is an investment company that Hunter Biden was very heavily connected to. And a man by the name of Bobulinski, who was also brought in to be the CEO of this deal that they were doing.
Bobulinski is a very credible figure. He's a former naval officer. He's also a former business associate of the Bidens, who's come out and done an hour-long interview that was released today on Tucker Carlson's program. And in that interview, he is basically the connector that confirms or verifies or refutes, in the case of however you're looking at this, the idea that Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, presidential candidate Joe Biden, didn't know what his son was doing. Bobulinski, in his interview, says that is absolutely not true. I spoke directly with the then vice president about these deals. They brought me in to kind of be a sort of guy that could get these deals done because, as he says, Hunter Biden had absolutely no experience in working in China or in doing deals of this kind.
He is highly credible. He goes into great detail that would be very hard to manufacture. It links up with emails and documents that are not of his origin, that have come from other sources. So I'm not going to attempt here to go into it all. I'll put the link to the Tucker Carlson interview in the program notes. I recommend everybody who's got a question mark over this still have listen to our 20-minute special last week and then go and listen to the Tucker Carlson interview. But I am now convinced that Joe Biden at least is a severely politically compromised candidate and potentially could be a very heavily corrupted candidate. So somewhere on that spectrum. But even if you take the best case part of that and say, okay, he's just somewhat heavily compromised, that's still quite terrifying to me. Meanwhile, we've got reporters and stories coming out in the Washington Post about Donald Trump's company charging the American government, the US government, for events held at Mar-a-Lago and the cost of a glass of water and all sorts of trivial sort of expense-related stuff.
They're all over that as though that's going to somehow tilt that. But what was interesting is, and I think that it's worth connecting this story to the debates, where this was the first time since the story broke where Joe Biden was put on the spot and said that he did not think that what his son did was unethical. He stated that on the record in the debate.
Okay, so let's just play a little bit of the Bobulinski interview with Tucker Carlson now, and then we'll come back and we will have a listen to what Joe Biden said in the debate.
I just want to restate this. You are not a grifter. You're not someone who's selling access. You're a legitimate businessman who's done deals in a lot of different countries. So I just want you to assess once more. Is there anything about Hunter Biden's personal experience, personal qualifications that would justify him doing a deal in Kazakhstan?
Absolutely nothing. The only thing that he had was the Biden family name and the fact that his father at one point obviously was a sitting vice president and potentially would run as a future president.
It sounds like a remarkably ambitious international business program they had running.
Extensive.
He and his uncle.
Extensive.
This is a small point, but I can't get over it. So you saw a number of reporters say, again, in an effort to bat away your story, your testimony on this, that the chairman referred to in a bunch of these emails was not Joe Biden. It was, in fact, the government of China. When you see people refer to the chairman thinks this, the chairman thinks that, they're talking about China and not Joe Biden. So I want to put up on the screen. Here is a text message you received from Hunter Biden to you. Hey, Tony, I have an idea. In light of the fact that we are in an impasse of sorts and both James's lawyers and my chairman gave an emphatic no, I think we should all meet in Romania on Tuesday next week. Now, so you're hearing reporters say that chairman was, in fact, the Chinese government. Here you have Rob Walker responding to you. Clearly there's some confusion over this, and he's saying, and I'm going to put this on the screen now, when Hunter Biden said his chairman, he was talking about his dad.
Correct. There's two chairmen in the story. There's Chairman Yi, who is the chairman of CFC.
Yes.
In that text from Hunter Biden, he was not talking about the chairman of CFC. And what Hunter's referencing there is he spoke with his father, and his father is giving an emphatic no to the ask that I had, which was putting proper governance in place around Oneida Holdings.
So Joe Biden is vetoing your plan for putting stricter governance in the company. I mean, and it's right here in the emails.
Yeah, Tucker, I want to be very careful in front of the American people. That is not me writing that. That is not me claiming that. That is Hunter Biden writing on his own phone typing in that I spoke with my chairman, referencing his father. If the world thinks that my chairman is not his father, then Hunter Biden would come forward and go on record and state to the world.
But you have the Biden family representatives, Rob Walker, saying right here, May 19th, no. When he said his chairman, he was talking about his dad.
Exactly.
Okay, Ray, so that was Bob Alinsky, Hunter Biden's business associate and the CEO of the company and deal that they were setting up, which allegedly involved very directly Joe Biden. Here's what Joe Biden had to say about it in the debate.
But now, with what came out today, it's even worse. All of the emails, the horrible emails of the kind of money that you were raking in, you and your family. And Joe, you were vice president when some of this was happening, and it should have never happened. And I think you owe an explanation to the American people. Why is it? Somebody just had a news conference a little while ago who was essentially supposed to work with you and your family, but what he said was damning. And regardless of me, I think you have to clean it up and talk to the American people. Maybe you can do it right now.
Vice President Biden, you may respond. 30 seconds. And then I do want to follow up on the election security.
I have not taken a penny from any foreign source ever in my life. We learned that this president paid 50 times the tax in China, has a secret bank account with China, does business in China, and in fact is talking about me taking money. I have not taken a single penny from any country whatsoever, ever.
I don't make money from China. You do. I don't make money from Ukraine. You do. I don't make money from Russia. You made $3.5 million, Joe, and your son gave you. They even have a statement that we have to give 10% to the big man. You're the big man, I think. I don't know. Maybe you're not, but you're the big man, I think. Your son said we have to give 10% to the big man. Joe, what's that all about? It's terrible.
All right, gentlemen, I want to ask you both some questions about all of this, but I'm going to let you both respond very quickly. You just said you spoke to your accountant about potentially releasing your taxes. Did he tell you when you can release them? Do you have a deadline for when you're going to release them to the American people?
I get treated worse than the Tea Party got treated. Because I have a lot of people in there, deep down in the IRS, they treat me horribly. We made a deal, it was all settled until I decide to run for president. I get treated very badly by the IRS, very unfairly. But we had a deal all done. As soon as we're completed with the deal, I want to release it. But I have paid millions and millions of dollars, and it's worse than paying. I paid in advance. It's called prepaying your taxes. I paid in advance.
I want to ask you both about questions regarding your potential foreign entanglements and questions that have been raised to give you both a chance to talk about this more broadly. Respond very quickly, and then I'll get to my question.
Why did he's been saying this for 4 years? Show us. Just show us. Stop playing around. You've been saying for 4 years you're going to release your taxes. Nobody knows it, Mr. President. What they do know is you're not paying your taxes, or you're paying taxes that are so low. When last time he said what he paid, he said, I only pay that little because I'm smart. I know how to game the system. Come on. Come on, folks.
So,
President Trump, and then I want to get to two questions to both of you on this.
I was put through a phony witch hunt for 3 years. It started before I even got elected. They spied on my campaign. No president should ever have to go through what I went through. Let me just say this. Mueller and 18 angry Democrats and FBI agents all over the place spent $48 million. They went through everything I had, including my tax returns, and they found absolutely no collusion and nothing wrong. $48 million. I guarantee you, if I spent $1 million on you, Joe, I could find plenty wrong. Because the kind of things that you've done and the kind of monies that your family has taken, I mean, your brother made money in Iraq. Millions of dollars. Your other brother made a fortune, and it's all through you, Joe. And they say you get some of it, and you do live very well. You have houses all over the place. You live very well.
All right, gentlemen, let me just ask some questions about all of this broadly. Vice President Biden, there have been questions about the work your son has done in China and for a Ukrainian energy company when you were vice president. In retrospect, was anything about those relationships inappropriate or unethical?
Nothing was unethical. Here's what the deal. With regard to Ukraine, we had this whole question about whether or not, because he was on the board, I later learned of a Burisma, a company, that somehow I had done something wrong. Yet every single solitary person, when he was going through his impeachment, testifying under oath who worked for him, said, I did my job impeccably. I carried out U.S. policy. Not one single solitary thing was out of line. Not a single thing, number one. Number two, the guy who got in trouble in Ukraine was this guy trying to bribe the Ukrainian government to say something negative about me, which they would not do and did not do because it never, ever, ever happened. My son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about, China. I have not had, the only guy made money from China is this guy. He's the only one. Nobody else has made money from China.
President Trump, let me ask my question to you.
But could I just one thing?
Very quickly.
His son didn't have a job for a long time, was sadly no longer in the military service. I won't get into that. And he didn't have a job. As soon as he became vice president, Burisma, not the best reputation in the world. I hear they paid him $183,000 a month. Listen to this. $183, and they gave him a $3 million upfront payment.
All right.
And he had no energy.
I'm going to let the vice president
That's
respond to that quickly, and then I need to get
dishonest.
to a question to you. Very
No
quickly,
basis for that. Everybody investigated that. No one said anything he did was wrong in Ukraine.
Okay, President Trump, this is for you. Since you took office, you've never divested from your business. You've personally promoted your properties abroad. A report this week, which was referenced, does indicate that your company has a bank account in China. So how can voters know that you don't have any foreign conflicts of interest?
I have many bank accounts, and they're all listed, and they're all over the place. I mean, I was a businessman doing business. The bank account you're referring to, which is everybody knows about it, it's listed. The bank account was in 2013. That's what it was. It was opened it was closed in 2015, I believe. And then I decided, because I was thinking about doing a deal in China like millions of other people. I was thinking about it, and I decided I'm not going to do it. Didn't like it. I decided not to do it. Had an account open, and I closed it.
Okay.
Excuse me. And then, unlike him, where he's vice president and he does business, I then decided to run for president after that. That was before. So I closed it before I even ran for president, let alone became president. Big difference. He is the vice president of the United States, and his son, his brother, and his other brother are getting rich. They're like a vacuum cleaner. They're sucking up money every
President Trump,
place he
thank
goes.
you. We do need to move on.
And that was from the final US presidential debate this week. Was supposed to be the third debate. It was actually only the second debate. I find it interesting the way that the moderators, both this one from NBC and the previous one from Fox, just constantly jump in and interrupt when it starts to get interesting. I mean, the first rule of good television is that you just let people go if they're starting to address each other in a debate and starting to interact. Let's hear it. Step back. Don't worry about your format that you've got. But I find that whole approach that they take to these debates quite stifling to getting to the truth, because we don't let it breathe. Anyway, never mind. Let's move on. Ray, so we've got Joe Biden. He's gone on record in the debate and said that there's absolutely nothing wrong, nothing unethical. So he's really doing everything he can to just keep the lid on this story until after the election.
He also thinks that it's all about Russian collusion, which Bobulinski even found laughable in the Tucker Carlson interview. So you've got a situation where clearly either Biden is misremembering something, or he's been coached to try to run interference and just simply dismiss this as a sort of Russian hoax or Russian hacking or Russian involvement somehow, and ride out the clock on the election until voting day and hope this story just goes away after that.
Well, we will see, and we'll see how big tech and the mainstream media, whether they start to cover the story in some sort of context or ignore it, continue to ignore it. Ray, one other thing that happened in the debate that we've got to address is the big comment on fossil fuels. Joe Biden said in the debate that he was going to have the country transition from the oil industry, that fossil fuels had to finish completely, something that Donald Trump really jumped on. Let's have a listen.
Okay, I have one final question.
Would he close down the oil industry?
It falls.
Would you close down the
By
oil
the way, I
industry?
would transition from the oil industry, yes.
Oh,
I will
that's
transition.
a big statement.
It is a big statement.
That's a big
because
statement.
I would stop.
Why would you do that?
Because the oil industry pollutes significantly.
I see.
And here's the deal. But
That's
you
a
can't
big
do
statement.
that. Well, if you let me finish the statement, because it has to be replaced by renewable energy over time. And I'd stop giving to the oil industry, I'd stop giving them federal subsidies. He won't give federal subsidies to the gas, to solar and wind.
Yeah.
Why are we giving it to oil industry?
We actually do give it to solar and wind. And that's maybe the biggest statement in terms of business. That's the biggest statement.
Okay.
Because basically what he's saying is he is going to destroy the oil industry. Okay. Will you remember that, Texas? Will you remember that, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma?
Vice President Biden, let me give you 10 seconds to respond,
Ohio.
and then I have to get to the final question.
Well, that was, I think, a real shocker. And the way that it came out reminded me of that scene in that movie with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men, when Jack Nicholson is on the stand and Tom Cruise is the Marine Corps lawyer.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
It's the same thing. Donald Trump was like, tell us your position, Joe. Are you going to end oil and gas in the United States? And Joe Biden comes out and says, yeah, I'm going to do that. And like Trump goes, oh, that's a big story. You hear that? Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, all those states that have big oil and gas industries or employ a lot of people in the oil and gas industry. I mean, this was the worst thing you could possibly say, especially when you've got a state like Pennsylvania so close to the line and the tipping point of going either towards Trump or Biden and resulting in the presidency. So that was.
So how do you feel now about the whole thing, given the Bobulinski, given the third debate, given the fossil fuels thing? What's your vibe now? You said Trump slide last week. Are you still feeling Trump slidey?
Of course. And I think that you've got a situation where it's far from being a done deal, but you've got a situation where voter enthusiasm is really high through those rallies. You've got a very clear message. Now Trump can point to a few things and say, Joe Biden wants to allow 11 million illegals to stay in the United States. Joe Biden is talking about this dark winter. I want to look at opening the country up. He wants to shut it down. Joe Biden wants to shut down the oil industry while we're self-sufficient and we're now a net exporter. So now there's a very clear, we talked about the ideological choice. Now there's a very clear political choice and a political direction in this. And then on top of all of that, you've got the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who will obviously be helpful in any possible litigation that results in some of these disputed ballots or disputed precincts after the election.
I don't know if she's going to be helpful. I mean, I took from Barrett's nomination hearings that she's a conservative policy-wise, but she's also a conservative legally, which means she's not into the Supreme Court being a policy agent. So I don't know if she's going to be driving policy that hard or be that politically biased in any of her decision-making. She's a straight-up sort of smart cookie. I was a bit shocked, actually, just on the Amy Coney Barrett story to see that, well, was I shocked or not? I was just amazed, once again, that the left, the feminists, so-called, the third-wave feminists, I should say, who are completely ideologically driven, couldn't bring themselves to celebrate a young woman being elected as a Supreme Court justice in the United States simply because she's Catholic and conservative. The hypocrisy, Ray, is just astounding to me.
And it doesn't stop there. If you looked at CNN's coverage, they labeled the swearing-in ceremony as a super spreader event. So on one hand, they're criticizing her, and then they're criticizing the event, but there's no real look at what this whole thing means, what it means for America.
So I think the impact of a couple of things. I think the media is not going to be able to ignore the Bobulinski interview. So that's going to have to hit the mainstream media in the next few days. I don't think that, I'm pretty sure that the fossil fuel statement is going to impact very negatively on a slice of the pie that Joe really needed to reassure for himself. The traditional working class Democrat, not the new inner city elite fossil fuel hating Democrat. I'm talking about the old traditional Democrat, the ones that have lost the Labor Party in Australia the last election, the one that lost the election in the UK, that group that Trump has seized from the Democrats are going to be cemented on after that statement about the fossil fuel industry, because there's 600,000 jobs attached to it just in Pennsylvania.
Add not only Pennsylvania, but add the state of New Mexico, which up until now hadn't been considered in play, Ohio, obviously some other states, Texas, which is a big energy state. You've got like a real situation now where people are looking at this and they, I think, have a much clearer choice. It's not just orange man bad. Well, I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to say that it's going to be a Trump slide. It's going to be very much definite. I think that he's going to get 55% of the popular vote, making it very difficult to challenge in any sort of big way. So he's going to win the big in the Electoral College, which is the deciding factor.
So the Electoral College, you need 70 to win. Ray, are you going to say, when you say Trump slide, are you saying 300 plus?
More than 300, and he's going to get 55% of the vote. Popular vote.
I'm nowhere near as confident, but I do think we're going to see Trump returned, and I'm going to put it at 275 to 290.
Okay, let's roll this back.
I didn't want to give myself too much of a range. It's not fair. No stakes this time. I'm not betting you a stake.
Here's the other thing that's important. If you're on the fence on this thing, who are you going to stand in line to vote for on voting day in the cold? Because it's cold in a lot of states in November in the United States. 3 hours, are you going to put that vote behind somebody who has this sort of radicalized agenda, might want to do a lot of things that you don't particularly agree with, or you're going to just stay home and stay in bed? Whereas the Trump voter, I think, given the rallies and given a lot of the way in which they perceive him to be treated unfairly by the media, and by proxy, they see themselves through him being mistreated, being canceled, being maligned and mocked for their beliefs. I think they're going to be more inclined to stand in line and cast their vote on that cold November day.
Well, Ray, I look forward to our chat next week.
Oh, yeah, it'll be interesting.
And that wraps up our 10th edition of The Other Side Australia. Thanks for your support. And remember, the best way to support us is to tell your friends about the show. And make sure they subscribe on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. And do so yourself if you haven't subscribed and clicked the like button yet. Enjoy the election week, everyone. And we will see you with all the lowdown and the wrap next Friday. Going to be a big one.